that we already have a lot of relatively far developed plans for LNG ports in northern Germany, which I think is a good circumstance, because now we have not to start for duty planning. We can start with starting the action. And this is what is going on now. Especially 2 terminals are relatively likely that the building process will start this year. And we are discussing with the companies that are doing this, that they should try to hurry up, and we are working on changing the legal scenario of this activity, that it can be done faster than it usually would, in a shorter time as it usually would take. So this is what we did, and so the truth is Germany is already working on diversifying the supply for the time we live in, and this fits very much to the long-term strategy we have. As you know, Germany is planning for getting rid of imports of coal, oil and gas in a relatively short time. 2045, we want to be a CO2 neutral industrial country. And being one of the biggest industrial countries in Europe and globally, it is something if Germany is saying this, because a lot of the energy supply we have is not for what people think, mobility or for housing and things like that. It's because of the industry. And if we are doing this, that we get rid of that, if we increase the production of electricity, for instance, with wind energy, with solar energy, if we strengthen our grid, if we work very hard to use hydrogen, which we will import as we import gas today, this will change the whole scenario. And many of the partners we are working now with are very happy to be also the partners, not just for a short-term gas supply, for instance, with LNG, but for a long-term supply with hydrogen, which we then can use for our steel industry or chemical industry also. So this is an already existing strategy, which becomes now more velocity and which we will work on, and this is one of the decisions we already took.
Next question here. Nächste Frage hier.
Ulrike Holtermann from the AfP. Chancellor NATO has announced 4 new battle groups. What kind of contribution is Germany doing? Well, these are decisions that are taken in a concert. You know that we are active in the enhanced forward presence in Lithuania. We bolstered these measures, and we're also contributing in Slovakia. You know that we participate in air policing in Romania, and we're willing to discuss other aspects should we be asked. In any case, the decision that we've taken to provide more financial means to the Bundeswehr, of course, this entails that we are going to be able to fulfill those tasks that Germany can do faced against the backdrop of its geographical situation. We can defend the country and actually have the necessary force in order to do so. Markus Becker from the Spiegel magazine. Mr. Chancellor, in the summit declaration, a mention was made of China. It called on China to stop doing anything that could help Russia. Did the American president threaten China? Would Germany agree to sanctions or impose sanctions on China should China support Russia? The position of the G7 can be read in the declaration that you just quoted, and we agreed on this joint declaration. It's no coincidence that the wording is like that. I can report that I also talked to the Chinese president on this question, together with the French president. We very much committed ourselves and encourage China to condemn the Russian aggression. Thomas Kutschke, FAZ.
Mr. Chancellor, You've just been listening to the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz speaking there after the NATO and G7 summits in Brussels. I want to bring in now David McKenzie, who's been following this live for us from our London bureau. And David, we heard a lot there from the German Chancellor about energy supplies. Germany and Austria as well rely heavily on Russia for energy. We did hear from the Chancellor that they have been trying to diversify their energy supplies, but right now energy is not part of this sanctions package.
Well, that's right, because Germany is heavily reliant on natural gas, coal and oil from Russia, more than 50% of their gas supplies. And the Chancellor has said several times that that is off the table because it would just have such a direct impact on Germany. He has said that him in a personal capacity over the years has called, prior to being the Chancellor, for a diversification of their energy in Germany. And nothing can be turned off quickly. He was hinting at this, that they are working quickly in Germany to try to be less reliant on Russian oil and gas. But here is the issue, is that over many years, many countries in Europe, but specifically Germany, have become dependent on this relatively cheap gas from Russia. And now they're in a situation where they're trying to put an economic squeeze while they still have a lifeline to Russia's government and to Vladimir Putin because of this dependence. So this won't be ending anytime soon, and it does complicate the situation in terms of the overall sanctions put in by the European Union and much of the planet.
It certainly complicates the situation when it comes to unity. We've seen so much unity amongst Western leaders when it comes to sanctioning Russia. But when you've got countries that rely more heavily on natural energy from Russia, it certainly seems like there's no obvious way to fill that demand right now. We did hear the Chancellor asked about expectations for the US president to make some sort of announcement to help fill some of that gap. But they rely so heavily, it seems almost impossible tapping into countries that can help out to fill that void.
Well, it will be very difficult. I mean, there might be in the next few months or years a solution to this issue. But what is needed, according to NATO and the G7 countries, is an immediate squeeze to try and stop the fighting. And you have seen Germany in particular take a very drastic change in its overall foreign policy, and particularly its military stance in the last few weeks. For many years, of course, they were reticent on giving direct military aid like this, and the Chancellor did remind everyone there that they are giving aid. But you've seen throughout the last few hours from leaders and from the NATO Secretary General himself.
David McKenzie, I'm just going to have to interrupt you for a moment. The French President Emmanuel Macron is speaking now. Let's listen in.
Well, avant que le Conseil européen ne se tienne, dans quelques instants, peut-être rendre compte
European Council, I meant to report to you on our NATO summit and G7 summit that just took place here, together with all of my colleagues. And I also meant to take stock with you, as a matter of fact, 1 month down the road, further to the triggering of the war of Russia against Ukraine. Where do we stand? The Ukrainian people, led by its president, has been resisting, notwithstanding Russia's calculation of a fast military victory. Together with our allies and European partners, we've been responding with firmness, reactivity and unity. Here again, against the Russians' calculation of a weak and divided response. So we're standing by the Ukrainian people with military, economic and humanitarian support, and Europe has been deploying welcoming capacity which is unprecedented, with more than 3.6 million refugees already in Europe, and we've adopted unprecedented packages of sanctions. This is totally unprecedented, and we've been doing that unanimously. The Russian economy is under pressure. It is unable to meet its payment obligations, and we will continue trying to obtain a ceasefire and peace by any means. These initiatives that we launched are still ongoing, and a few moments ago, the humanitarian resolution proposed by France and Mexico has been adopted by 140 votes in favor and only 5 against at the UN. And that shows that Russia now is isolated. Indeed, Russia has taken a historical responsibility by waging this war, and our strategy is indeed to do our utmost to prevent any escalation, but also to put an end as quickly as possible to the war, thanks to our sanctions discussions that are still ongoing with a few of us and President Putin to find the means of a negotiated solution. The NATO summit this morning enabled us to acknowledge a few points. First of all, the unanimity in order to continue to support Ukraine, provided with defensive equipment and the equipment that it needs. President Zelensky was with us by way of a video link and clearly expressed his needs, so we agreed to continue to provide some offensive weapons, lethal weapons, with a red line. We want, of course, to be efficient, but we do not wish to be co-belligerent. This is also the reason why I will not provide you with any details. But together with the German Chancellor and a number of other Europeans, we also insisted upon the fact that in this context we shall continue to work on a credible negotiated solution. The second thing out of our summit is the necessity of preventing any escalation of this conflict. Why not providing any pretext which could be used by Russia to argue that we provoked the escalation. NATO has made a choice, and that is to support Ukraine to put an end to this war without going to war against Russia. And we lastly decided to adopt our posture, our stance to the new strategic situation provoked by the war in Ukraine and its consequences. And in this respect, I would like to say that France is very much shouldering its responsibility and acting in solidarity from north to south of the eastern flank. You can see here a map, a very clear one, which shows all of our current commitments, which have been increased in the previous weeks. In Norway, that was meant to be. As you see, France is a major contributor with some 3,200 troops. On call response, accordingly, we have a strong commitment. And I would like to express all of our condolences to the United States of America for the death of 4 soldiers who lost their lives in the context of this exercise. In Estonia, we also decided not only to maintain but to reinforce our presence. We have about 350 troops with strengthened missions. We were already there, but we increased our presence on land, and we also added some air missions. France is contributing to air policing missions on behalf of our Baltic friends. In Poland, southeast of the alliance, we also increased our presence. As you can see, the choice that was made from the very beginning was to contribute to the air scheme all the way to the south of the alliance. Through our missions, we are contributing to monitoring a vigilance air scheme, and we also using our carrier strike group and adding our capacities to Romania and Bulgaria. And we're also monitoring Bosnia, thanks to our carrier strike group. And I would like to say even more so that the choice that I made and announced in front of the European Parliament is that we very much want to commit within the context of the NATO response force. 550 French soldiers with the contribution of a number of other member states. And accordingly, France is part of this operation in Romania, which is likely to be increased thanks to the presence of Belgium and the Netherlands. So as you can see, from the north to the south, France is currently a concrete contributor to our alliance and to the strategic European rearmament, for which I launched an appeal before the European Parliament. So we very much are in favor of a Europe that is shouldering its responsibilities. And also it shows that this Defence Europe is part of NATO. It is not something to replace it or to compete with it. And over the past few weeks, I think this has only given more credibility to our message of the complementarity of these two missions. Over the past few weeks, we also worked, and we will continue to work as Europeans on the strategic compass that will then enable us to prepare for a joint position that will be come to a conclusion at the Madrid summit. And this is something that we launched at the end of 2019, when I said it was at the time important for us to reorganize our strategic efforts and to reorganize our strategy within the alliance. All of that is now mature and will, in particular at a time when we are very much being tested. And I believe that we are bringing about the right response to the war in Ukraine. The G7 summit added to this response on different matters. First of all, regarding the sanctions, with very close cooperation, like I said, we responded then very quickly with a series of sanctions, of 4 packages that have been very well coordinated on the second day of the conflict to begin with, and we constantly responded as Europeans, as allies, and the G7 has been a very important way to coordinate. And these 4 packages of sanctions were fully coordinated. And we've decided within the G7, we agreed upon a mechanism to monitor the sanctions, to make sure that we have transparency, a proper implementation of the sanctions adopted, to make sure that there are no differences between the various members, because that would only weaken the coherence of the group, and also to assess these mechanisms to make sure that our finance and justice ministers work together in order to implement these sanctions, and also in order to prepare future decisions if these ones were required. And we stand absolutely ready to increase these sanctions every time that is necessary. We also agreed to mobilize all together when dealing with some friendly countries, other partners, make sure that even though they're not part of G7 or NATO, they can either relay our sanctions or to make sure that we limit any strategy used by Russia in order to try and avoid the sanctions or compensate them. Of course, these sanctions are having an impact. I was referring earlier to the economic impact in Russia, and we shall continue to have these deterrence effect. Second, we agreed upon an agenda of solidarity between the members, because the consequences of the war are not the same within the members of the G7. The same goes for NATO, and that requires solidarity. First of all, in the management of the refugees. First of all, Europe, of course, for reasons of geography, is the first contributor. And if there are 6.5 or 7 million of displaced people from Ukraine, we already have 3.5 million Ukrainians in Europe. And this is one of the greatest challenges for Europe since the Second World War. And have in mind in particular the countries that are the most impacted, the neighboring countries of Ukraine. And in addition, we also need to extend our solidarity vis-à-vis countries which are neither members of the alliance or the EU, Moldova, for example. So that already led us to put in place some relocation strategies, and France has been contributing over the past few days. So what we've been asking for our G7 partners is to stand in solidarity, and together with the Europeans, for example, for the United Kingdom, Canada, the United States, Japan, we requested them to help together with the UNHCR and other organizations so that we could share this solidarity. It is first and foremost something very concrete for all of us, and it is also what will enable us to tackle efficiently, to fight any form of human trafficking, and to protect in particular these families, children and women who are at the moment in this situation that we know. The second proof of solidarity is in relation to energy. Again, this is due to our geography. Europe is the main buyer of fossil fuel because we're not producing, so we're dependent on Russian gas and oil. So, of course, we first of all want to control the prices, and we'll be dealing with that at the European Council later on today. But we also want to diversify our supplies so that we're not exposed to reprisal from Russia, and we also want to reduce, of course, what we buy from Russia. So phasing out our dependency on Russian oil and gas also requires that we diversify our supplies, and it also requires that we coordinate within the G7. Some of the G7 members can increase their production, some others can help us diversify our supplies. So this is what's been acknowledged together with the United States and Canada in particular, because they can contribute, or they contribute a great deal on fossil fuel, and we can also coordinate to reduce our dependency. This is something very important to me, and it adds on to our strategy to reduce our use of fossil fuels. Of course, we have to be coherent with our climate strategy, and we know it will take time, but in between, we need to diversify. And this is where the G7 coordination strategy is important. Lastly, last kind of solidarity, it is in relation to the food solidarity. Like I said on a number of occasions, Ukraine and Russia are huge producers, in particular of grain. And we can see in Europe the tensions on prices, and that led the Europeans, including France, to put in place some programs in order to support them, to support our farmers. We're dealing with that. Nonetheless, we're all confronted to a price increase. And also, nonetheless, we are getting closer to a food crisis because some other countries in the Middle East, in the North Africa, they're so dependent to feed their populations on what is being produced in Ukraine and in Russia. So the war in Ukraine and the choices made by Russia, irresponsible and very serious choices made by Russia, and these are Russian choices, are impacting Maghreb, Africa, the Near and Middle East, and these countries, as a result, are having difficulties to buy wheat and other cereals. And some depend 80% dependent on Russia. And the war in Russia, in Ukraine, is preventing Ukraine from preparing for the next harvest. So this is likely to generate a humanitarian crisis in many countries and will have massive consequences in many of the countries I referred to. So against all of that, we cannot stay put. We need to react, take action, and in the discussions I'm having with President Putin, and as you know, I'm always calling for an immediate ceasefire, and I'm also insisting, and let me tell Russia once again, very formally, that we want all restrictions on food supply exports to be lifted. We want to make sure as well that Ukraine can sow seeds. And it is important that Russia shows that it is acting responsibly and does not bear responsibility for a looming famine, which will otherwise happen inevitably. So we need to build a future. We need to mobilize all of our partners, all of the international partners and the entire agricultural industry. And as the head of the European Council during this semester, and in coordination with the African Union, and I just spoke to Macky Sall, we want to launch an initiative, something comparable to Act A that was put in place for COVID-19 vaccines. The purpose of this initiative, and we decided to call it Food and Agricultural resilience mission. And the purpose of this initiative is to get organized immediately, hand in hand with the relevant countries and organizations, including the private sector, to launch an initiative to tackle the crisis. First of all, there will be a trade pillar in order to ease the tensions on the agricultural markets, to make sure that the stocks are properly managed, to deal with any risk of price increase. And we need to make sure that the stocks can be released as quickly as possible. Second, we want to make sure that there's an international commitment not to put any restrictions on exportations. This is very much very similar to what we've seen on medical equipment and projects 2 years ago with COVID. And we want to make sure that there are no restrictions and that we can rely on information on agricultural markets. That's something that was put in place during the French presidency of the G20. Of course, all of that will be dealt with in close coordination with the WTO, and we've been working with its Director General to that effect. Next, we want to, this summer, work together with the producing countries to increase production where it is possible without compromising on sustainability goals. We want to allocate the volumes, make sure that the most vulnerable in particular have access to sufficient quantities at a reasonable price. Here again, it is a mechanism that's very much similar to the ACT initiative taken in answer to COVID-19. So very concretely, it means that for us, the Europeans, we acknowledge that we will be producing more while complying with our rules, but while being extremely vigilant regarding biodiversity and environmental goals, but at the same time while contributing to this solidarity effort. And lastly will be a third pillar in terms of solidarity by investing in resilient agricultural supply chains and by intensifying our operations to make sure that the most dependent countries dependent on Russia and Ukraine, in order to enable them to produce on their land. So this is very much in line with what was launched in 2021, the Great Green Wall Initiative, as well as the protein European initiative on protein, and it is to cover the entire region from the Gulf of Guinea to the Horn of Africa to make sure that these countries can produce more on their land. Such is the initiative that I presented at the G7 and meant to present to you. All of the G7 countries are major producers, and I believe we should be outstanding. We should set the example, and we will, of course, discuss it at the European Council later on today, and we will open up at the G20 hand in hand with the African Union and all of the countries that are most impacted. So this is what I meant to say by way of a summary of our work at the G7 and the NATO summit, and the announcement I meant to make this French initiative in favor of food security.
Camille Collin. So we now have time for a few questions. Camille Collin from TF1. Mr. President, I have a question about French companies that are based in Russia. We were able to see that Renault has suspended its business there. This central state is part of that company's capital. Now, there are other companies that have made a different decision, for example, Leroy Merlin. So what is the position that you defend, and what is the message that you convey to those businesses, those companies that are being mentioned and identified by the Ukrainians? Let me return to the basis of our action. Our purpose is to put an end to the war. So we want effective sanctions that will affect the more sensitive sectors and individuals. But of course, we want to avoid having too much of an impact on our economies. But of course, there will be an impact, and so we try to mitigate that. That's the reason why we focused on banks, the central bank. That was probably one of the most decisive measures that we took. We focused on that and on the oligarchs. But there are other types of sanctions that we could consider in other strategic sectors, which are very important for other European partners. We're thinking, for instance, of coal, oil, and gas, but for the moment, we haven't taken any decisions in those sectors. With that in mind, I have explicitly said that I want the companies, the French companies that work in sectors where there are sanctions and that are working with partners where sanctions have been taken, well, that these companies have respect for France's decisions in terms of sanctions, and that is what is being done. Now, alongside that, there are pressures, there are risks in terms of the reputation of those businesses that are operating in Russia, and my view is to let those companies decide what they want to do. It is up to the leaders of those companies to assess the situation, look at the pros and the cons, look at their business and business model to see what decision they want to make. And you have seen the decision that Renault has made. Other activities have decided to stop doing business. I feel that our priority should be the final outcome. And the final outcome that we want is to put an end to Russia's action. So that is the position of France. Now, over the long run, my sense is that those decisions will need to be reassessed, because when the company decides to stop its business in Russia, it is leaving behind workers and other people who continue to be in Russia. So what is the impact on the country? Is it really worse for the leaders in that country? I don't know. That is a question I have. It means that in that case, Russian capital will be taking over this profitability. So I think that we need to be coherent and consistent. Renault made a decision, and the French state, as a shareholder, did not object to this decision. It was one which was in line with its strategy, and it was done on the basis of an understanding of the situation for that company.
I'm Linda Kincaid. You've just been listening to French President Emmanuel Macron. Western leaders are meeting in Brussels right now for emergency NATO and G7 summits as Russia continues its unprovoked bombardment of Ukraine. Right now, we are waiting to hear from the British Prime Minister, among others, following this historical gathering. Well, CNN's Natasha Bertrand is standing by for us live in Brussels and joins us now. Natasha, we have heard from various leaders today, including the French president who's speaking right now, saying that NATO has made a choice to support Ukraine without going to war with Russia. We heard from Ukraine's president earlier saying that he wants to see 1% of all of NATO's tanks and fighter jets. What can we expect? We've just lost Natasha there. Our apologies. We're going to bring in Michael Balsowitz, who joins us now. He's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, a former spokesperson for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. He's coming to us from Lviv. Good to have you with us, Michael. So we have been listening to various world leaders. The president of France is speaking right now, saying that NATO has agreed to support Ukraine without going to war with Russia. In terms of the help we can expect from NATO, it doesn't seem they're going to quite offer exactly what Zelensky wants, which he's been calling for 1% of all of NATO's tanks and fighter jets.
Yeah, well, if the NATO leaders, including Mr. Macron, thought they were doing a tsunami of policy making or statecraft, by the time that news hit here, it was a ripple. Ukrainians continue to feel that they're in this largely on their own in this fight against Russia. And that the point you made is exactly correct, is that they don't want to become belligerents in this war. They'd like to, it seems to me, and to I think other people I spoke to here, that Ukraine deal with this as a kind of proxy war for the West. Ukrainians tell me one after the other that their women, their children are shedding blood or dying because of not enough action from the West. And I think that's why President Zelensky made that bold request to ask for 1% of NATO assets. They're, I got to tell you, Linda, they're missing a lot of stuff here on the field. There's something called the, Volunteer Territorial Defense Force, and you still have young men going to the front line in T-shirts and baseball caps because they don't have body armor and they don't have, they don't have proper helmets. And, the other thing I just noticed a few moments ago, literally looking out my window here in Lviv, is that as much as a lot of people in the West think that their efforts are going to bring a quick end to this war. The thinking right here is very different. As I speak to you right now, the big cathedral next to me, they're boarding up their windows. That is happening right across Lviv, this ancient city. And that to me indicates that the Ukrainians themselves, who know the Russian psyche very well, are preparing for a long conflict, a long war with Russia.
Yeah, it certainly seems that way. Michael Bosecure, I want to come back to you in just a moment, but I think we do have connections now with Natasha Bertrand, who is in Brussels. Natasha, we have heard from NATO. Oh, it sounds like we're still having some difficulties getting through to Natasha there. We will come back to her in just a second. If I can come back to you, Michael, several cities are facing heavy shelling. The southern port city of Mariupol facing near constant bombardment. Earlier this week, we heard that officials there saying that bombs are falling almost every 10 minutes. In terms of military help, why is the US still opposed to providing fighter jets in Ukraine?
Well, I think it's still that Western leaders, and I respectfully to Mr. Biden, have not grown the spine to stand up to Mr. Putin. I think they're still afraid of him. Why? Because he has that nuclear arsenal, and because we can't put it past him to use chemical, biological weapons of mass destruction. So they're very nervous about that. I think they believe that Mr. Putin is more unhinged these days. He's more desperate, having seen battlefield progress not proceed the way he thought. It's sad, Linda, because I think that the Putin circle are going to resort to more of that bombardment, bombing populated centers into submission until they see some concession from Ukraine. And I got to tell you as well, Ukrainians are very nervous about Mr. Zelensky being forced into peace talks with Mr. Putin because they aren't prepared to give away any concessions from this side anyway.
In terms of other concerns on the ground, there are major concerns that Russia might resort to weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons, biological weapons, nukes. The NATO summit, the G7 summit, EU Council, they're all discussing that very issue today. How would they respond, do you think, should Russia cross that line?
Yeah, I saw the NATO promise. I don't even understand what they mean by bolstering their defenses in terms of what it means here on the ground in Ukraine. You know, Linda, there have been so many red lines crossed that should have been proper red lines by the West. And I'm referring to what I wrote for CNN Opinion about the bombing of that maternity ward at that hospital where there were deaths, including that pregnant woman with her child. If chemical weapons were to be used here, and indeed there are reports that phosphorus has already been used, I don't know what the West will do. I can tell you this, is that the Ukrainians don't put much faith in Western promises, assurances. So that's the other thing you're seeing is Ukraine forming more micro-alliances with neighboring states that are also possibly in Putin's crosshairs.
All right, Michael Bosecure, good to have you there in Lviv, Global Affairs Analyst. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Well, on the ground in Ukraine, the war has officially entered its second month. A senior U.S. official now saying the Ukrainian military has pushed back Russian forces east of Kyiv by some 25 kilometers. And Russian troops are taking defensive positions northwest of the capital. Further to the south, Ukraine's military says it's destroyed a Russian ship in the Russian-occupied port city of Berdyansk. We're also seeing fresh images of the devastation in some of Ukraine's hardest hit cities. This video shows destroyed buildings and debris filling the streets in Chernihiv. The area has seen some of the most intense shelling. Well, new today, this sobering statistic from the United Nations. More than 1,000 civilians have been killed in Ukraine since the start of the invasion. Well, in his address to the NATO summit in Brussels, Ukraine's president accused Russia of deploying phosphorus munitions. Now, phosphorus, of course, can ignite on contact, and if it's used to attack civilians, it could violate international law. Well, CNN can't independently verify the president's claim, which follows similar accusations made by regional governors in Ukraine. CNN's Phil Black joins me now live from Lviv. Good to have you with us, Phil. So let's start with those claims by Ukraine's president. What more can you tell us about the use of that in the east of the country?
His claim, Linda, when speaking to NATO leaders today, was that phosphorus weapons had been used this morning. He said, men are dead, children are dead. Those were the words. As you say, it's a very serious claim, one that is backed up by other regional authorities through this war, but can't be verified at this stage. Incendiary weapons, those phosphorus weapons use an incendiary chemical to burn at a very high temperature. It is not the chemicals themselves that are outlawed, but to use them on civilians or in civilian areas, that does contravene international law. So it's something that human rights groups will be investigating, but for the moment it remains an unverified claim.
And Phil, this war is today a month since it began. It's now in its second month, and Ukraine is making some gains from what we've seen. They say they've destroyed this Russian ship in this Russian-controlled port, and it seems that this ship was used to transport weapons for Russia.
Yeah, equipment and armoured personnel carriers is what Russia has said. It was apparently the first Russian Federation vessel to dock at this particular port once it was captured by Russia. In the very early days of this war, those explosions began upon the ship around 7 o'clock local time. And you can see from video that was captured this morning, there was several explosions. The explosions kept coming. And indeed other Russian vessels in dock there sort of had to scramble to escape. The Ukrainians say 2 other ships at least were damaged in this attack. They say that a big fuel tank was destroyed too, and a fire moved into a weapons depot, and perhaps that explains why we've seen so many explosions in that video. But the fire did go on for some time. I think crucially what the Ukrainians haven't revealed, if they did this, is just how they did it. What weapons did they use? What military capability did they deploy to do something which, in the context, is pretty extraordinary, destroying a Russian vessel in a Russian-controlled port. Linda.
Yeah, really extraordinary images we're seeing there. Phil Black for us. Good to have you with us from Lviv, Ukraine. Well, we are going to take a quick break. We'll be right back with much more. Stay with us. You're watching CNN.
You can help the refugees from Ukraine. Join the over 70,000 who've already raised millions for food, shelter, and more. Explore cnn.com/impact. Click to take action.
Unpredictable environment, and news races around the world at breakneck speed.
Our engine continues, our impetus, our momentum.
My show brings you the latest news and top news makers. Give me the facts on voter fraud.
There has never been a moment where voter fraud has affected the outcome of an election.
And we also dive below the headlines to explore vital issues impacting our lives.
Normally this theatre would be filled with people and art and debate and energy. And so now we have to rely on the 2 of us.
How interesting is it to be Tyler Mitchell today? It's crucial we make sense of what's happening. There seems to be some confusion that maybe you can clear up. Where are the US forces in Syria going? And fully understand what's at stake.
What's happening now in the world is a great thing because people are talking about subjects they never did before.
Amanpour, tonight on CNN.
Welcome back. Russia's stock exchange opened Thursday for the first time in a month, but there are severe restrictions. Only 33 stocks are allowed to trade. Short sales are banned, and foreign investors are not allowed to dump shares. Well, Anna Stewart is joining us live from London with more on Russia's return to trading. Good to see you, Anna. So the White House is calling this a charade. With all the restrictions on trading, are they right?
Well, only 15% of listed shares were trading today. You mentioned some of the limitations, a ban on short selling, a ban on foreign investors selling their shares, and limited hours of trade, actually. And what we saw today was the main index, the MOEX, was trading up, well, it ended up 4%. It was up actually over 10% at one stage today. And that really doesn't tally with what we are seeing in terms of the economic situation. Just to recap, this index fell over 30% following the invasion of Ukraine. It was closed for nearly a month. And during that time, of course, the West have imposed really damaging sanctions on the economy. There are export restrictions impacting companies. Western firms have stopped their operations, stopped exporting products. This will have had a massive impact for some of those big listed companies that were trading today. Now, the White House didn't just call it a charade. They also said Russia has made clear that they're artificially propping up the shares of companies they are trading. We cannot confirm that, but the price reaction we saw today just does not tally with the reality of the economic and financial situation on the ground.
Yeah, it certainly doesn't. And Anna, Europe still relies heavily on Russian gas. Russia wants European countries from so-called unfriendly nations to start paying for that gas in rubles. What's the chance of that happening?
I mean, this was a proclamation yesterday from President Putin in a meeting with ministers that was televised. And we don't have a huge amount of detail. For instance, what would Russia do if countries refuse to pay in rubles, and what the deadline really is here. Now, yesterday, the German economy minister said that changing the payment would be a breach of contract, so it wouldn't be legal. So you'd imagine that these countries would have to agree to it. He said EU leaders would discuss. And I want to show you a tweet from the Ukrainian foreign minister, who, of course, is urging Europe to ignore Putin's demands. He says if any EU country bows to Putin's humiliating demands to pay for oil and gas in rubles, it will be like helping Ukraine with one hand and helping Russians kill Ukrainians with the other. I urge relevant countries to make a wise and responsible choice. But of course, the problem, and you mentioned it, is Europe's huge reliance on Russian gas. That accounts for about 40% of imported gas into the EU. They plan to cut down their reliance on Russian energy, or Russian gas at least, by 2/3 this year. But right now, today, they are very reliant on Russian gas, so I cannot see that happening.
Yeah, and we did hear from the German Chancellor a short time ago saying that those contracts for those gas imports are either in US dollars or EU. So he said basically that can't happen. According to the contracts, we'll see how this plays out. Yeah. Anna Stewart, good to have you with us from London. Well, 2 bombs exploding in Somalia have killed 48 people, including a female lawmaker. Now, they happened Wednesday in a town about 300 kilometers north of Mogadishu. Among the dead are Amina Mohammed Abdi, who is running for re-election. Reports say the attacks were claimed by al-Shabaab militants, which had been trying to disrupt the election process. Well, the United States is condemning what's believed to be North Korea's first launch of an intercontinental ballistic missile in more than 4 years. Officials say it flew about 71 minutes before landing in waters off Japan's western coast. It's North Korea's 11th launch this year. CNN's Will Ripley joins us now from Taiwan with more on this. So this is meant to be the first ballistic missile since 2017, landing near Japan, while Japan's leader is at this summit in Brussels.
And just met with the U.S. President Joe Biden. Japan's prime minister particularly outspoken here, so calling this launch reckless, unacceptable, and Japan, of course, because the missile was essentially fired at its shores, coming down in its exclusive economic zone, the waters that are immediately surrounding Japan's main island and the northern island of Hokkaido. This launch, Linda, was more powerful than anything we've seen from North Korea, even their ICBM, the Hwasong-15, that was tested in November of 2017, also in July of that year. This missile, we don't know exactly what it is yet, but a lot of analysts think it's probably an upgraded version known as the Hwasong-17, a new kind of ICBM that went higher. It flew longer and was in the air for a longer period of time than any other North Korean missile that we've seen. It flew for 71 minutes, and it reached a maximum altitude of 6,200 kilometers. So basically, the trajectory was almost straight up and then down. So even though the distance that it traveled, just over 1,000 kilometers, didn't take it halfway around the world, for example, to the United States. What North Korea demonstrated with such a long flight time and such a high altitude is that this missile could hit pretty much any city in the United States. What they haven't shown yet is how many warheads they could attach to this. Some analysts are saying this is a missile that could potentially carry multiple warheads, which would make it much more difficult for missile defense systems to defend against, because if you have multiple warheads coming in at once, missile defense systems could maybe shoot down one, maybe two, but if you have a whole lot more than that, they could easily be overwhelmed. So North Korea, Linda, demonstrating that they have now a weapon that could potentially kill millions of people by hitting a major city in the United States or many other targets around the world. Why are they doing this now? You could look at it two ways. One, are they taking advantage of the fact that the world is focused on the war in Ukraine to test this technology that they've been developing for quite some time, including, frankly, during the period of diplomacy known as the Korean détente between Kim Jong-un and the former U.S. President Donald Trump? Or are they doing it now, knowing that world leaders are in Brussels, trying to insert themselves into the global conversation because they feel relatively ignored by the Biden administration, which has made overtures for talks that the North Koreans have long felt, Linda, are disingenuous. Some have called this a monster missile that North Korea, really has. They now have the technological capability to actually come through with some of the threats that they've been making for years. The question is, how is the international community going to respond? Missile defense systems, many might argue, are not the answer. The real answer is diplomacy, talking to Kim Jong-un, and they're only willing to do that at the very top level. So is President Joe Biden willing to write letters like President Trump? Well, we just have to see. If he doesn't, North Koreans could keep doing this unabated, Linda.
All right, Will Ripley, we'll leave it there for now. Thanks for joining us from Taipei. Well, coming up, Russia has catapulted Ukraine's children into an unthinkable crisis, and the result could be felt for generations. The impact of this war on young people when we come back.
Through investment in STEM schools, Egypt has committed to building a more diverse and inclusive workforce. They are encouraging women and girls across the country to pursue careers in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. By ensuring that they are not just represented, but are also empowered to thrive across all sectors, Egypt has demonstrated their commitment to investing in the country's youth and in the mission to achieve sustainable development goals.
In a special ongoing season of the Tug of War podcast, CNN reporters are on the ground in Ukraine, documenting Russia's invasion, the escalating conflict, and what it means for the rest of the world. Tug of War. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Being a Restovac robs these children of their soul. They never feel like they're valued. I remember one of the girls said to me, "It's as if I'm living, but I don't exist." My name is Joan Kahn, and I am the Executive Director for Restovac Freedom Foundation based in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. Restovac Freedom Foundation works with children who are living as Restovac. It's a form of child slavery. Many of them work from sunup to sundown. They do most of the chores for the family. When CNN came to Haiti for the Freedom Project with Common Dreams, we found this child in an area that we work. Her name is Fedna, and she lived with her grandfather at the time. And we went to visit the grandfather and asked if he would allow her to go to school. And he agreed to do that. And so we actually took her and enrolled her in school for the first time. She was 9 years old. Now Fedna is 20. And so she's in the 10th grade. They get a really late start on life, but at least they are able to be part of society. And I think just seeing these children become visible to people is a powerful thing.
Coronavirus. To get daily news updates in your inbox, sign up for the CNN newsletter. Coronavirus. Fact versus fiction.
Welcome back. One refugee from Odessa left almost everything behind when she fled the war. But now she's using her musical talent to help lift the spirits of others. Miguel Marquez has the story.
Pianist Tetiana Shabayeva from Odessa. Tonight, she's playing for Ukrainian refugees like herself.
It's very important, I think, because it's a concert that I want to play for people and to give my energy.
Shabayeva fled with her 13-year-old nephew Nikita, who she's helping raise, her mother, and her 5-month-old daughter, Monique Amalie.
It was too much for my babies. Too much, because she can't sleep when it's all the time alone. And this bombarding.
It's very scary.
Really?
When you hear blow, it's very scary.